All right, now let's move into part two of this Money Runs the World episode in the Federal Reserve Control System and the Crypto Kill List. So let's transition from our first Money Runs the World segment of free energy suppression, which should be abundantly clear to you is quite real. And now the Federal Reserve Control System, why centralized banking runs the world, and the more recently extremely frightening Crypto Kill List. So the title of my essay I wrote about the Federal Reserve is "The Federal Reserve is Literally Illegal, a Century of Crisis, Control, and Conspiracy, Jekyll Island, Executive Order 1110, the Titanic Conspiracy, and way too much more." So this one high-level paragraph: Federal Reserve System created illegally and maintained through murder is the greatest ongoing conspiracy against the American people. This essay proves its unconstitutional origins at Jekyll Island, documents the suspicious deaths of its opponents from the Titanic to JFK to crypto pioneers, and exposes how a private banking cartel hijacked America's money supply through engineered crises. With CBDCs now threatening to complete their century-long plan for total control, the question is not whether we've been enslaved, it's whether we will fight back before it's too late. The table of contents of my Fed Reserve essay and of the spoken version in this podcast. We got the intro, the greatest heist in the history of the world. The part one, we have the formation of the Fed, Andrew Jackson's warnings, the panic of 1907, the Titanic coincidence, and the Jekyll Island meeting. Part two, we have consolidation through crisis, which touches on the Great Depression, the profit machine, JFK, the fiat empire, and Nixon's golden break. Part three, bodies, blackmail, digital tyranny, the global banking cartel, the audit resistance, the 2008 rehearsal, dead crypto kings, CBDCs, and the 2020 test run. Part 4, conclusion, the rebellion, and endgame scenarios. Now, the Federal Reserve is indeed the greatest heist in the history of the world. For more than a century, the Fed has been sold as a neutral stabilizer of markets and the lender of last resort, but it is nothing of the sort. The Fed violates Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress alone the power to coin money and regulate its values. But since 1913, a private banking cartel has hijacked America's currency and killed to maintain its monopoly. The plan was hatched in secrecy on Jekyll Island in 1910 by 6 men who controlled a quarter of the world's wealth. The panic of 1907 that justified its creation was almost certainly engineered by the very bankers who swooped in as its quote-unquote saviors. Their blueprint was rammed through Congress in December 1913, while most representatives were home before Christmas, and even the 16th Amendment, which was used to impose the income tax, which some Supreme Court justices like James Fox has been on the record saying that not enough states ever ratified the 16th Amendment. There's certainly a lot of ambiguity as to whether the 16th Amendment was ever properly ratified, and funnel interest payments to the Fed. Andrew Jackson is the guy that saw this dangerous century earlier, overtly declaring war against the central bank of the USA, and he succeeded, but only for 77 years. Because the bankers didn't learn from their defeat. They were patient, they were ruthless in their next go-about. Andrew Jackson defeats the second bank of the U.S., 77-year gap of no central bank in the U.S., and then here comes the Fed. So it's an undeniable pattern. 1912, Titanic sinks, taking with it John Astor, Ben Guggenheim, and Isidore Straus, three of the wealthiest opponents of central banking by J.P. Morgan. And obviously JP is the one who financed both the ship and the Fed, conveniently canceling his trip last minute. I'll get into the Titanic conspiracy in a moment. There is JFK, who signed Executive Order 11110 to restore monetary power to the Treasury. There seems to be some ambiguity as to whether that was an actual overt move against the Fed or more of a transitionary move to issue silver-backed certificates while the power transitioned to the Fed. But whatever the case may be, he passes this exec order. 5 months later, he's dead. And then now, today, we have crypto pioneers like Nikolai Mushegian, a warning of intelligence-linked blackmail networks and turning up dead. So across every generation, this cycle repeats. Engineered crises, assassinations, and solutions that just consolidate control even more. The central bank has just been becoming more and more central. The rich get richer, obviously, the poor get poorer. That's just how the world works, unfortunately. But It's just not crazy to say that this banking cartel deliberately engineered the Great Depression. They severed gold from the dollar. They fueled perpetual war for profit and designed a debt system where every dollar created requires more than a dollar to repay, which is a mathematical certainty for enslavement. And now they're rolling out CBDCs, which is essentially programmable money that can be tracked, frozen, or expired at will. And so my essay is going to present the evidence from Vanderlip's confession about Jekyll Island to Ben Bernanke's admission about the Fed's depression errors, from the executive order to Nikolai Mushegin's final tweet. The question is no longer whether the Fed is legal or moral. The question is whether we're going to allow their 111-year plan to end in permanent digital slavery, or whether crypto, state-level rebellions, and a mass awakening can finally break their grip. The Federal Reserve is not just illegal. It is the biggest crime in American history. Welcome to the show. All right, that was your intro. Now let's get into Chapter 1, Part 1. Part 1 is the fraudulent formation of the Fed. Chapter 1, we got Andy Jackson's war against the central bank. Jackson is one of the few presidents that really just get me fired up. So in 1832, Jackson faced down the most powerful financial institution in America, the Second Bank of the United States, and he won. He declared, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And this was unfortunately not hyperbole, because in January of 1835, Richard Lawrence aimed not one but two pistols at Andrew Jackson's chest and pulled the trigger. But by an act of divine intervention, both guns misfired. It was a rainy day. Apparently the rain got lodged into the guns and allowed Andrew Jackson to live. And that was a pivotal moment in history. The gods have spoken at that moment by allowing Andrew Jackson to live, allowing Jackson to dismantle the central bank. And Andy beat the would-be assassin with his cane until bystanders intervened. But it's quite curious about this assassination attempt, is that Lawrence, who was, of course, labeled a paranoid loony acting on his own demolition by the media, he himself claims that wealthy Europeans had promised to protect him if he killed Jackson, and that was he. And he said he was owed a European inheritance, but that Jackson's destruction of the central bank had blocked him from receiving it. So we have a dude literally saying that European banking interest put him to the task to assassinate Jackson. And, there's no concrete evidence. Like I said, do your own research. A lot of this stuff is speculative. I'm not trying to create any enemies. I'm not trying to create any false narratives. I'm just giving you the facts. There's no concrete evidence that this assassination attempt was indeed a full-on central bank conspiracy, but worth noting, Andrew Jackson himself obviously suspected this was a political conspiracy, naming old enemies like John Calhoun and Senator George Poindexter, the latter of whom had literally employed Lawrence just months before the assassination attempt. Lawrence painted Poindexter's house a month before. He did the painting at his house before this butchered kill shot. And Calhoun publicly denied involvement, and affidavits implicating Poindexter collapsed under scrutiny. But Jackson's conviction that powerful interests tried to kill him certainly stuck, and they set the tone for how he framed his battle against centralized money and moneyed interests. So between Lawrence's eerie claims and the fact that this unemployed lowlife just so happened to be playing buddy-buddy with a sitting senator, forces any logical person to ask themselves, what are the odds that the first man to ever try to assassinate a U.S. president just so happened to be hanging around one of the most powerful senators in Washington for no apparent reason whatsoever? And what's also the probability of a coincidence that he himself claimed that European banking interest put him up to the task? A morsel of independent thought is going to allow you to believe that this inheritance may have been a euphemism for promised payment. And his fixation on European bankers is obviously consistent with Jackson's own warnings about foreign money powers. Jackson definitely understood what modern Americans have forgotten, that central banking is fundamentally about control, not stability. And the second bank, like the Fed today, was a private corporation given monopoly power over public currency. It could create boom-bust cycles at will, choosing winners and losers, enriching allies, crushing enemies. Jackson called it a hydra of corruption, vetoed its recharter, and declared if Congress has the right to issue paper money, it was given to them to use by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations. And by 1836, Jackson did what he said he was going to do. He killed the bank. It was, most remarkably, he had done something no president had ever done before or ever done since. He paid off America's entire national debt. Last time America was debt-free was under Andy Jackson in 1835. And he warned that the bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they perpetuate this institution. He clearly saw what modern Americans are now missing when banks create money from nothing through fractional reserve lending, loaning out 9 times what they actually possess, and all money enters circulation as debt requiring interest. The result is design scarcity. And this is why the Federal Reserve is in the same episode as the free energy, because while free energy is the invention type energy form of the Federal Reserve, both of these systems that we live in that are controlled by the most powerful people alive is a designed system of scarcity. We're forced to compete for survival in a game where there's literally never enough money to pay all debts. The universe is abundant. Scarcity is a concept thwarted on us by the wealthy and powerful people that run the world. And so on his deathbed in 1845, Jackson named killing the bank his greatest accomplishment. For 77 years, America would remain free from central banking and crucially free from the debt trap. But bankers learned from Jackson's victory, and next time they would work in darkness. Next time they would remove opposition before it could form. Next time they would ensure America would never be debt-free again. Next time they would win, and the president would lose, and the public would lose. From Chapter 1 to Chapter 2 we go. From the 1800s and Andrew Jackson, let's go to the Panic of 1907, which was a crisis by design. I titled this J.P. Morgan's First Punch. So in October of 2007, the American financial system literally collapsed overnight. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, New York's third largest trust, failed after rumors spread about its president's role in a botched copper speculation. Bank runs erupted. The stock market lost nearly half of its value. Credit froze. Panic gripped the nation. Enter Mr. J.P. Morgan. Funny enough, he is one of the central characters, not just in the story of the free energy, but in the story of the Federal Reserve as well. The 70-year-old titan of Wall Street who single-handedly saved the American economy from his private library, Morgan locks the nation's leading bankers in his study, literally refusing to let them leave, until they agreed to his rescue plan. He decided which banks would live and which would die. The press hailed him as a hero, and Congress demanded reform to prevent future crises. But the question remains, J.P. Morgan painted himself as the savior, as America would believe at the time, but if you do any research, you realize he was not a savior, he was a stage manager. The copper scheme that set off the public was run by his rivals. The rumors that toppled the Knickerbocker Trust Fund, that was circulated by his allies. And the institutions that survived were Morgan's friends. Those that failed were his competitors. Here's one guy getting super ambitious, super powerful, and doing everything in his power to increase that power. Frederick Allen, in his classic biography of Morgan, noted the suspiciously perfect timing that the Panic of '07 was a dress rehearsal for the Federal Reserve System. Senator Robert Owen, a co-sponsor of the Fed Reserve Act, went further, saying the panic was brought about by a deliberate conspiracy for the enrichment of those who engineered it. One more time, Senator Robert Owen, co-sponsor of the Federal Reserve Act, said the Panic of 1907 was brought about by a deliberate conspiracy for the enrichment of those who engineered it. Do some research. You're going to agree with Mr. Owen. He continued saying, I think that the panic was artificially created. I believe that the panic was brought about by a deliberate conspiracy having for its purpose the enrichment of those who brought it about, and incidentally to use the panic for political purposes and suppress the progressive movement. The so-called cure for Wall Street's conspiracy was to give Wall Street permanent control. And the kicker is that even though Owen knew that the panic was an artificial and deliberate conspiracy, he just didn't care. He co-authored the Fed into existence. That either makes him a naive jackass who actually thought the Fed would break up Wall Street dominance by creating regional Federal Reserve banks, or probably more likely a duplicitous gangster who wanted to tell the American public the truth while feeding the system he claimed to fight. So he kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, like a lot of these guys have. He's trying to tell the American people the truth, but he's going to go ahead and benefit himself. And so, in all likelihood, despite Owen's better intention of disseminating the truth about the engineered and conspiratorial nature of the Panic of '07, he fed the Fed, and the Fed fed him in a high-stakes game of quid pro quo. So whether it was fully manufactured or merely exploited, the Panic produced exactly what the bankers needed. Public demanded a solution, and that solution was the Federal Reserve, drafted by the very men who profited from the chaos. So, Chapter 2, the Panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan's first punch. It was a deliberate panic. Now let's go Chapter 3, the Titanic, probably one of the more fascinating, speculative, it's not so speculative, but it's kind of speculative, chapters of the Federal Reserve control system. Dead men tell no tales, JP's second punch. April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic took 17 souls to the Atlantic floor. Among them were 3 of the wealthiest men in America and the 3 staunchest opponents of the Federal Reserve Plan, which was circulating through elite circles. John Astor, worth $87 million in billions today, he reportedly declared that the central banking would enslave the American public, enslave the American people to the European model. The heir to America's first great fortune understood compound interest and debt-based currency. Astor is 1, Ben Guggenheim is 2. The mining magnate refused participation in the growing banking consolidation. His family fortune operated independently of Morgan's sphere. They were known rivals. And Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's, he also opposed the creation of a central bank, believing it would concentrate too much power in a few hands. Meanwhile, the men who would create the Federal Reserve either survived or weren't on board. So obviously, J.P. Morgan owned the White Star Line, the Titanic's parent company. He canceled at the last minute, citing illness. People don't realize J.P. Morgan literally owned the Titanic. He was supposed to be on it, and then he cancels last minute. Paul Warburg, the Federal Reserve's architect, who was the representing the interest of the Rothschilds, he wasn't on board despite supposed to being on board as well. And then there is Senator Nelson Aldrich, who stayed in America. There is more disturbing details as well. The ship was traveling at maximum speed through a known ice field. The SS Californian was just 10 miles away, which had inexplicably shut off its radio at 11:30 p.m. minutes before the Titanic's distress calls began, and its crew allegedly watched multiple rockets rise into the night without taking action. Really weird tangential story with the USS Californian, only 10 miles away, turned off its radio for some unknown reason, and did not help the Titanic. The cherry on top is that the ship's lifeboat count was reduced from 48 to just 20 days before the launch because the deck would look cluttered. You can probably blame J.P. Morgan for that. Just reduces the lifeboat count by over 100%. Obviously, that's going to go ahead and reduce the chances that Strauss, Guggenheim, or Astor survived. But that's not all. Curiously enough, the key to the binocular locker was missing, leaving the lookouts blind at the worst possible moment. This is why they didn't see the iceberg. They had no binoculars. Just the stories, the details keep adding up. It's weird as fuck. And then there is Bruce Ismay, J. Bruce Ismay, the one senior White Star executive on board, a close associate, business partner, and friend of J.P. Morgan. He somehow survived while the vast majority of men aboard perished. And so if there was anyone positioned to orchestrate a disaster from the inside, it would be him. And he is the one that survived. He probably knew what was coming. He probably got on one of the first lifeboats. So yeah, critics are going to dismiss all of this as coincidence, but go ahead and take a step back. Go ahead and just, digest what I have just told you. Morgan owned the Titanic. He was supposed to be on it. He inexplicably dipped out at the last minute. America's 3 wealthiest alleged opponents, the Federal Reserve and Central Bank, went down with the ship. Probably the Federal Reserve would never have been created if these 3 men survived. The nearby vessel's radio went dark. The Titanic pushed full throttle into a known ice field. Binoculars locked, lifeboats cut, survival odds tanked. The very next year, Federal Reserve was born. And And obviously, who else but J.P. Morgan sitting at the center of America's new banking monopoly? As researcher John Hammer noted, the Titanic was the vehicle which eliminated opposition to the Federal Reserve. And so is the Titanic Fed conspiracy speculative? Sure, you can say it's speculative if you want, but these eerie coincidences do not give the theory legs. They give it giant wings. And so whether you call it coincidence or conspiracy, the Titanic was not just a shipwreck. It was the perfect prologue to the most significant banking coup in the history of the world. All right, for Chapter 4 of the Federal Reserve Control System, we are going to go to Jekyll Island, when the conspiracy becomes reality, JP's third, final, and knockout punch. So, 2 years before the doomed fate of the Titanic in November 1910, a private railroad car left Hoboken, New Jersey under cover of darkness. Its passengers had been told to come one at a time, using only first names, and to bring hunting gear down as a cover. Their destination was Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private resort owned by the world's richest men. Their mission was to design America's central bank system. And so these 6 conspirators controlled an estimated quarter of the world's wealth. One more time, the 6 people involved at Jekyll Island controlled 25% of the world's wealth. We have Senator Nelson Aldrich, who I mentioned before. He was the Republican leader, Rockefeller's father-in-law. So Senator Aldrich represents the Rockefeller family. We have Paul Warburg, who was he represents the Rothschild interest. So Aldrich, Rockefeller, Warburg, Rothschild. Frank Vanderlip was the president at National City Bank, which is now Citibank. Henry Davison, senior partner, J.P. Morgan. Benjamin Strawn, head of the Bankers Trust, later first Federal Reserve chairman. And then we have Piat Andrew, who's the assistant secretary of the Treasury. So the 6 people involved at Jekyll Island represented the Rockefellers, the Rothschild, Citibank, J.P. Morgan Bank, and then the Federal Reserve itself and the Treasury. And so for 9 days, they crafted what would become the Federal Reserve System. Vanderlip later confessed in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. So at least we have one of the guys confessing in broad daylight that, yeah, they created the Federal Reserve at a secret meeting in Jekyll Island. But the genius of their deception was multi-layered. They called it federal, though it would be private. They called it a reserve, though it would create money from nothing. It was neither federal, and they had no reserves. And so they designed 12 regional banks to appear decentralized, but obviously they were not decentralized at all. While ensuring New York controlled everything, they avoided the word bank entirely, knowing Americans' hostility to central banking. So most brilliantly, they initially opposed their own plan. It was Aldrich who introduced it to Congress, and then Warburg testifies against it, calling it insufficient. And this game of theater convinced critics that if Wall Street opposed it, it must be good for the people. William Jennings Bryan, the populist hero who had fought banking interests for decades, was fooled into supporting it, but not everyone in Congress was duped. It was Congressman Charles Lindbergh that issued a fiery warning in 1913. He said, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the indivisible government by the money power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the age is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill." Charles Lindbergh, Congressman. This is one of the most important quotes. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. Charles Lindbergh. That tells you everything you need to know about the Federal Reserve. And then in December 23, 1913, while most of Congress was home for Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act passes. It was under President Wilson, who owed his election to banking interests. He's the one that signed it. Wilson would later be alleged to have been quoted saying, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit." Whether that quote is true or not is highly disputed. It probably is, or it would have never surfaced. But clearly Wilson had a lot of regret about allowing this to go through. And so this was what I call the financial coup of the century. From Jackson's War to the Titanic's sinking, from the engineered panic of '07 to the secrecy of Jekyll Island. The pattern is unmistakable. Crises, coincidences, and covert operations paved the way for the greatest financial coup in American history and in all likelihood in human history. The Federal Reserve was not born through democratic debate or popular demand. It was smuggled into existence by a handful of men who understood that controlling money meant controlling the nation. The coup was complete. America's century of financial enslavement had begun. So following chapter 4, we got chapter 5 in the beginning of part 2. Part 2 is consolidation through crisis, the Great Depression, the profit machine, JFK, the fiat empire, and Nixon's golden break. So if part 1 was the heist, part 2 is the consolidation. Once the Federal Reserve was smuggled into existence, the bankers didn't just sit back and collect interest. They weaponized every crisis, every panic, every war, every assassination to expand their control. So what emerged between 1913 and 1971 was not just a central bank, it was the beating heart of a global empire. Let's get into chapter 5, the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve's first massacre. So 16 years after the Fed was created, it hit its first real stress test. And the way it handled the Great Depression is basically the blueprint for how power consolidates in a crisis. Pump cheap money in the 20s, help inflate the bubble, then tighten credit right as the whole thing's overheated. And when the crash hits, instead of flooding the system with liquidity like a true stabilizer, the money supply contracts and thousands of banks collapse, mostly small ones. Even mainstream economists like Friedman and Schwartz argue the Fed policy deepened the Depression, and Ben Bernanke famously admitted the Federal Reserve's role in a speech later on. So decades later, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke publicly admitted the Fed was behind the Great Depression. He says, regarding the Great Depression, you are right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. This was at a 2002 speech at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday. And yeah, you just heard that correctly. The Federal Reserve Chairman, in a prepared speech, admitted that the Federal Reserve intentionally caused the Great Depression. And the takeaway isn't that they are evil geniuses. It's simpler and scarier. Crises do not hit everyone equally. They wipe out the weak and consolidate power into the hands of the biggest players. So yeah, Ben Bernanke to William Milton Friedman on his 90th birthday. And in my mind, this is like the semi-moral chairman of the Federal Reserve telling a 90-year-old dying famous economist Milton Friedman that, yeah, you predicted that the Federal Reserve created the Great Depression. My birthday present to you, your dying wish is me admitting to you that, yeah, we did. So that was pretty nuts. And then the gold grab was April 1933. FDR signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for Americans to own gold. This is pretty wild, pretty North Korea of the United States of America to make it illegal to own gold. Citizens had to turn in their gold for $20 an ounce or face 10 years in prison. Once the government had the gold, they revalued it to $35. They basically just stole a 70% profit directly from the American people. The excuse was an economic emergency, but the reality is that they were removing the last check on unlimited money printing, and sound money was now dead. Let's go to chapter 6. We got the profit machine. That's the fact that the wars feed the Fed. The Federal Reserve, the central banking system, is inextricably linked to the military-industrial complex. So when you zoom out, you see the cheat code is war. I mentioned a few times that the Federal Reserve started in 1913. I think we all know what happened right after that. Here comes the Great War. Here comes World War I. It explodes right after the Federal Reserve is born, and suddenly it's easy to fund massive conflicts because the money printer exists. Debt balloons, the war bonds get issued, and interest payments flow back through the banking system. World War II takes it even further, and then the Bretton Woods locks in the next level. The dollar becomes the reserve currency, and the IMF and World Bank become enforcement tools of the dollar system through loans and structural adjustments. So whether you call it an empire or global leadership, the mechanics are the same. Crisis expands control, and war is the most profitable crisis of all. General Smedley Butler, War is a Racket. I haven't actually read that book, but apparently it's what a lot of people point to. So yeah, World War II perfects the model. Enter Prescott Bush. People don't know George Bush, double George Bush, father, grandfather. It all comes from Prescott. He was a director of the Union Banking Corporation, a Wall Street bank tied to Nazi industrialist Fritz Thyssen, with Hitler's early backer. So yes, the George Bush's dad, George Bush Sr.'s dad, Prescott Bush, was tied to a neo-Nazi and tied to the American Central Bank. So in October 1942, the U.S. government seized Union Banking under the Trading with the Enemy Act for its Nazi connections. But the record is clear. Bush's bank was caught financing Hitler's regime as American soldiers were dying in Europe. One more time, Prescott Bush, father of George Bush Sr., was caught financing Hitler's regime. That's Adolf Hitler's regime, even as American soldiers were dying in Europe while World War II is going on. The father of the two most known presidents in the United States history is financing the Nazis. But Bush and his partners faced no criminal charges. After the war, their assets were unfrozen. They made millions off the very empire that had been laundering Nazi money. The dynasty thrived, and I got to the General Smedley Butler quote a little bit too early, but as he warned in 1935 and wrote a book about it, war is a racket. World War II proved just how lucrative that racket could be for America's banking elite. So yeah, the Prescott Bush and the war Nazi rabbit hole is makes you realize how important the central bank is to running everything, and how shit just gets swept under the rug, and how uninformed we all are about the stuff that actually matters. All right, let's move from Chapter 5, Wars Feed the Fed, to, or is that Chapter 6? Chapter 6 to Chapter 7, the Kennedy Challenge. A president versus the money machine. So the JFK chapter is where the story turns into a cultural third rail. The argument people make is that Kennedy represented a rare kind of threat, not just political, not structural. Obviously, we know he was challenging the intel agencies, de-escalation, Vietnam skepticism. We know he was taken out for world peace, and we'll get into, I don't know, I only did a little bit in the JFK in my first episode. I didn't even get into like the Ben Gurion, Numek, Israeli stuff, but we know he was taken out by powerful interests because he aspired for world peace, because he was going to shatter the CIA into a million pieces, because he opposed the secret societies that ran the world. But he also, people think that he also opposed the central banking system and Federal Reserve, which would obviously make a lot of sense, considering all the other entities that he opposed, by signing Executive Order 11110, which gets interpreted by, some as this step towards shifting currency issuance back toward the Treasury via silver-backed notes. But there's a lot of ambiguity with this executive order, because people say it was just a transitory executive order, and that he was not challenging the Fed. He was just allowing the Treasury to issue silverback certificates because they wanted to use up everything that they had left in the depository, but he was still keen on expanding the Federal Reserve's interest. So there's a lot of ambiguity with the JFK thing. It might be look for a red car and you'll find a red car in the JFK challenging the Fed. Maybe he didn't actually challenge the Fed, but he definitely challenged the system that the Federal Reserve bankrolled. So there's no challenging that aspect of things. So at minimum, JFK becomes the symbol of a warning. Presidents are elected, but the deeper system, money, intel, and war, does not like being challenged. Now, Chapter 8 is Nixon's golden betrayal, aka the final heist. So in 1971, there's this game over moment where the dollar fully detaches from gold, temporarily becomes permanently, and money becomes pure faith and force. So after 1971, the petrodollar arrangement keeps global demand for dollars alive because oil is priced in dollars, and the average person lives the downstream reality. Asset inflation, wages lagging, and a world where whoever is closest to the money spigot wins first. This is the point where your life becomes more expensive by design, not by accident, because in a fiat system, the incentives reward debt, speculation, and permanent expansion. And this is the final shift from the central bank experiment to full monetary regime. And so the results were immediate and devastating for ordinary Americans. Since 1971, the dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power. Wages stagnated while the cost of living exploded. The rich closest to the money printer thrived, and this is called the Cantillon effect in action, where banks, corporations, and elites get new money first, buying up assets before prices rise. And so by the time that money trickles down to workers as wages, inflation has already eaten its value. The numbers don't lie. 1971, the average home price was $25,000 and the average income was $10,000, the ratio of 2.5 to 1. Today, average home price is $450K, average income $70K, ratio of 6.4 to 1. And pre-19, worth noting that inflation literally only started when the Federal Reserve started in terms of consistent inflation. Inflation would bounce back and forth and would essentially remain neutral and consistent before 1913. Then the Federal Reserve takes over and it's just a positive, consistent correlation. Pre-1913 prices were like a yo-yo, inflation and deflation up and down. Post-Fed, especially post-1971, the price level basically becomes a staircase. Sometimes it pauses, but the long-term direction is always up. I mentioned this one before, but the story of all the gold missing in Fort Knox, which is where the United States stored all of our gold reserves. There was a Rockefeller secretary by the name of Louis Boyer, a former Rockefeller aide, who wrote a letter about the Rockefellers giving all their gold to the elites of Europe. This is probably the Rockefeller-Rothschild alliance strengthened keep in mind, this alliance between two families means one of the families taking the gold reserves of the entire country of the United States and giving it to the other family in Europe. This is not just this is insane stuff. But a day later, she is thrown off a balcony and dies. Obviously it's speculative to say that Louis Boyer was killed by the Rockefellers. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's coincidences. There is a data point there. Because of Nixon's golden betrayal and the switch to the petrodollar system, and I just gave you the 1971 versus today's ratio of average home price versus average income, it's not crazy to say that the American dream didn't die naturally. It was murdered by monetary policy. So some of the final thoughts on part 2, the financial coup complete, before we get to part 3, from Andrew Jackson's defiance to Jekyll Island, from the Panic of '07 to the Titanic, and from the Depression to JFK's death. Every step had been preparation for this moment, and by 1971 the bankers had turned their secret coup into a global empire. They had engineered depressions, financed world wars, seized America's gold, and finally severed money from any tangible anchor. Kennedy's silver notes died with him. LBJ flipped that policy, like many other policies that LBJ flipped. Nixon's temporary suspension of gold redemption locked the world into a fiat regime backed only by oil, debt, and force. The Federal Reserve had not just survived its birth, it had mastered the art of crisis, weaponizing every shock to consolidate total financial control. The consolidation phase was over, the exploitation phase had begun, and what followed would make everything that came before look like a mere rehearsal. There's one fact I want to point out. It's that World War I started months after the creation of the Federal Reserve. All right, now we're finally moving into part 3 of the Federal Reserve control system: bodies, blackmail, and digital tyranny. From dead, yes, this is a pine cone. From dead presidents to crypto corpses to your coming enslavement. So if part 2 was consolidation, part 3 is escalation. By the 1970s, the bankers had secured their empire. Fiat currency, petrodollar hegemony, and a monopoly on money creation. What followed was darker, a world where assassinations, financial crises, and blackmail operations became routine tools of control. Presidents, financiers, and crypto pioneers alike fell in their path. Meanwhile, the system evolved into its digital form, a cartel hiding behind global institutions unaccountable to nations, preparing the ultimate weapon: programmable money. Chapter 9, the global banking cartel, who really runs the Fed. And who runs the Fed is kind of who runs the world. And I mentioned the Rothschild, the Rockefeller control system, the dude who represented Citibank, the dude who represented JP Morgan Bank, the people that created the Fed at Jekyll Island. That gives you kind of the beginning of the answer, but that answer has modernized a bit. The part that people don't really want to talk about is that the Fed isn't necessarily the top of the pyramid. It's one node in a global central banking ecosystem, and the modern world runs on coordination between central banks, mega banks, and now asset managers. And so what exists now, what did not used to exist, is the asset managers that run the world. Obviously, it's BlackRock, it's Vanguard, it's State Street. They all own each other. But besides them, there is the BIS, the Switzerland one, the Davos, Jackson Hole, and the Group of 30. You can just call it the revolving door if you want. The point is the same, that the people steering monetary policy are not your elected reps. It's a tight network that meets constantly, speaks the same language, and protects the system first. In the modern era, the real plot twist is that the old family vibe is less important than the institutional ownership vibe. The three big asset managers I just named, they own everything through index funds and using everyone's retirement money as a remote control lever on the real economy. Chapter 10 is the audit resistance. So if the Fed is actually legitimate, why does it freak out anytime someone says, "Can we see the books?" It was Ron Paul, one of the few good men left in Washington, that didn't even start with "let's abolish it." He just said, "Let's audit the Fed. Can we please audit the Fed? Can we please see what you guys are actually doing? Can we see what the central bank that runs the country, can we just see some receipts?" That is a pretty simple ask. And the response was essentially vampire behavior. The Fed lives in that perfect legal twilight zone, not fully public, not fully private, which lets it dodge real accountability when even partial transparency hits. You see the vibe, trillions moving, major banks being backstopped, foreign institutions getting supported, and then the curtain drops again. The whole point is, the parts that matter most are the parts you are not allowed to see. And so that's why Ron Paul's Federal Reserve Transparency Act, aka the Audit the Fed Act, was such a grenade, and it shouldn't be. But after 2008, when the public found out that the Fed had secretly lent out $16 trillion, yes, $16 trillion, people started asking, what else were they hiding? And so Paul's bill got over 300 co-sponsors in the House, super bipartisan, and for one shining moment, it looked like the Fed might actually be forced to open the kimono. And when a partial audit finally squeaked through, not even a full audit, just a little sliver of an audit, the leaks were absolutely insane. It showed that the Federal Reserve lent $2.5 trillion to Citigroup. This is all with a T. $2 trillion to Morgan Stanley, $2 trillion to Merrill Lynch, $1.3 trillion to Bank of America, billions to other foreign banks like the RBS and Deutsche. That is just the stuff we were allowed to see. That was just the partial audit we were allowed to see. So imagine what is in the parts that they kept blacked out. Gold reserves, rigged markets, backroom deals with foreign governments, political payoffs, UAP, money laundering, probably all of the above. And so the Fed made sure that the Transparency Act never got teeth. And every time it came close to passing, the Senate and Wall Street lobbyists shut it down. The joke literally writes itself. Audit the Fed was the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, and the Fed killed it to stay opaque. The Federal Reserve Transparency Act was killed by the Federal Reserve so that they could not have any transparency. Do you guys do you hear this? Do you hear this? And there's obviously going to be a connection to Donald Rumsfeld and the missing $2.3 trillion the day before 9/11, and the likely black budgets into UFO programs and defense contractors all through the bank, and it all uses the Fed Reserve as their monetary control system, which is why I labeled this part of the Money Runs the World episode the Federal Reserve Control System. It's all a control system. Now, Chapter 11. More about the control system, the 2008 rehearsal testing total control. So 2008 is when the system learns it can essentially do anything in a panic. Congress gets the ransom note, the markets tank, the politicians fold, and behind the scenes, the Fed runs a far larger liquidity machine about the public narrative ever admitted at the time. The real heist, ultra cheap money flows to the top, assets inflate, the rich get richer, normal people get a cost of living future that never stops climbing. It was Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, fresh out of Goldman Sachs, who stormed into Congress with a 3-page ransom note, $700 billion in taxpayer money, no oversight, no accountability, and legal immunity for everyone involved. And so when Congress hesitated, the market conveniently tanked 777 points in a single day, which was the biggest drop in history at the time. So Congress folded and Wall Street got its $700 billion blank check. But the real kicker is that this was just a public shakedown. Behind closed doors, the Fed was secretly running its own bailout machine, $16 trillion off-the-books loans to U.S. and foreign banks. The number only surfaced years later in the limited audit Ron Paul had fought for, we just talked about. And so while the Americans were told that $700 billion was the price of saving the system, the real tab was over 20 times higher and hidden from the very taxpayers footing the bill. And then the real heist is when the Fed printed $4.5 trillion through quantitative easing, which was a euphemism for counterfeiting on a galactic scale. Banks got money at 0% interest, yes, 0% interest, and then used it to buy up stocks, bonds, and real estate. So they essentially just, quantitative easing is a fancy word for buying real assets with fake money to consolidate power. So asset prices soared while wages stagnated. The rich multiplied their fortunes. Everyone else got stuck with inflation and debt, just like that. In the 1930s, the small players got wiped out while the giants consolidated. And so too big to fail was not just a label. It was a business model. Main Street collapsed. Wall Street ate its lunch. So the real question here in this section, the 2008 rehearsal is, did the Fed deliberately create the subprime bubble? That question has kind of been answered with the Panic of 1907 and the Great Depression, and that's probably because those were a long time ago, and kind of the truth takes a while to come out, and you're going to be labeled a conspiracist if you say the Fed deliberately created the subprime bubble, but they created other panics in the past. But what is at least undeniable for now is that when this bubble burst, the Fed did not just respond, they exploited the crisis at a stress test for total control. Obviously, the pattern remains the same. They benefit from panic, they consolidate their power, they get more powerful, and the public gets weaker. All right, Chapter 12 is probably the scariest rabbit hole in the entire Federal Reserve control system story, not because it's modern, but because there is a large quantity of people who threaten the system via decentralized cryptocurrency that would kind of render the Federal Reserve System and central banking system not as important. And they all died in mysterious circumstances. So Chapter 12 is titled Dead Crypto Kings, Digital Freedom Meets the System. Crypto was supposed to be the exit ramp. It was supposed to be money outside the system. And then there is this string of high profile deaths of people connected to decentralized versions of cryptocurrency. And the internet has kind of framed this as a potential kill list. Of course, this is speculative, and I'm not saying any of these are government assassinations. I'm not trying to provide anything else but the facts, allow for public discourse, and allow me to speculate on these important data points. So the pattern is this: young builders, massive stakes, weird circumstances, and in a couple cases, public fear statements right before the end. Nikolai Mushegian is my main character in this segment. John McAfee is my second main character in this segment. Mushegian, he's the most infamous modern example. He posted about paranoid warnings about blackmail and intelligence-style networks, and then dies hours later in Puerto Rico. There's John McAfee's jail death. I'll get to his case in a second. There's a couple other guys I'll touch on in a moment. But the end result is that the crypto world starts to feel like a place where freedom money attracts both geniuses and predators, and where mysterious is a recurring adjective. And so the reason this matters is not to scream, oh, they killed him. It is to ask the adult question that, like we have seen before, and like why this is in the same section as the free energy section, when a technology threatens the monopoly on money, what does the system do? Do they co-opt it, regulate it, infiltrate it? And does anyone who won't play ball end up unusually exposed or perhaps unusually 6 feet under when they were not supposed to be? So my essay on this was titled An Investigation into the Mysterious Deaths of Cryptocurrency Pioneers and the Dark Theories That Connects Them. It was in 2022 that this all started happening, and it was in 2022 when crypto pioneer Nikolai Mushegian tweeted that the CIA and Mossad were running a blackmail ring out of Puerto Rico. He says his ex-girlfriend was a spy and that he's going to be tortured to death and killed hours later from this tweet, when he tweets that the CIA and Mossad are running a blackmail ring out of Puerto Rico and that he's been compromised and he's about to die. He dies. And so this expose dives into his final warnings, the pattern of dead crypto elites, and terrifying theory that the deep state is hijacking the blockchain revolution one corpse at a time. But Nikolai was known to be very paranoid. He was deeply paranoid about government infiltration of the crypto space in general. Increasingly, he believed that he was being watched. According to those close to him, Mushegian had grown convinced that intel agencies were not only monitoring the cryptocurrency ecosystem, but actively working to control it. He believed the crypto world was being hijacked by state actors, intelligence cutouts, and deep state proxies, and he did not keep this to himself. He was very outspoken, and that's probably why he died. But he tweeted bombshells like the one I just mentioned, and another one, which read, "There's 3 possible futures for me. 1, suicided by CIA. 2, CIA brain damaged slave asset. 3, worst nightmare of people who fucked with me up until now." I am sure those are the only options. Very, very eerie, very stark tweets put out by Nikolai Mushegian. And so Puerto Rico, I titled this section Crypto Paradise or Epstein Island 2.0, because Puerto Rico has attracted some of the most controversial figures in the crypto space, including Brock Pierce, a former child actor turned Bitcoin mogul with documented ties to Jeffrey Epstein circles. Pierce has hosted exclusive events like Blue Sky that bring together crypto elites, politicians, and international power brokers in an environment of extreme secrecy. So yeah, Brock Pierce is kind of the pedo elite guy who runs the crypto world. And then Mushegian believed this combination created the perfect environment for what he called entrapment blackmail rings. Similarly to the Epstein files, Mushegian believes that operations designed to compromise wealthy crypto figures and bring them under intelligence control. So yeah, like what better way to control a decentralized financial system than to control the people with the most influence over it? So yeah, hours after Mushegian sent off that insane tweet, he was only 29 years old and he was the co-founder of MakerDAO. That's MakerDAO, which was one of the most decentralized financial protocols ever built in the history of the world. He was found drowned off a Puerto Rico beach, wallet and phone intact, no signs of a struggle, officially ruled an accident. He was not the only one. Some other people, the crypto body count. We have Mircea Popescu. He's a Bitcoin billionaire that drowned in Costa Rica in 2021. Tiantian Kullander, Amber Group co-founder, died in his sleep in November 2022. Vaishalev Taran, the Libertex founder, died in a helicopter crash in November 2022. Fernando Algaba, found dismembered in Argentina in 2023. And then there's John McAfee, found dead in prison after tweeting about having 31 terabytes of incriminating data in 2021. Worth mentioning, McAfee also literally got a tattoo on his arm that said whacked. He tweeted, "I'm doing well in prison. If I kill myself a la Epstein, it will be no fault of my own." He predicted that he was going to be whacked. And his death occurred right before he was extradited to U.S. soil, and when he got killed, he said he was going to have a dead man switch that was going to release a bunch of incriminating data. That never happened, but what did happen is on his Instagram appeared a post of just the letter Q. We know what that represents, and I'm not a QAnon conspiracist, but probably about half of QAnon has come true from the Epstein files, and probably we're waiting for the release of the rest of the Epstein files for the next half of QAnon to come true. But this is the McAfee story, and that's a very touchy story. I've talked to people like AJ Gentile of the Y Files, and he says that he's afraid to do a John McAfee episode. Maybe I should be afraid to be talking about him, and I should be afraid to be talking about all of this stuff. But, like I said, I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not blaming any entities. I'm just a user of the First Amendment. I'm just collecting some data points that I think are curious. And you'll note that all of these deaths that I just mentioned occurred from 2021 to 2023, all in a 2-year period. 5 of the most powerful people in the crypto world that are actively, creating these cryptocurrencies that are decentralized, that all end up dying in super suspect ways. So it's not just the timing that connects these deaths, it's what they all represented. They're all involved in projects or activities that threatened centralized control over digital assets. So Popescu was a Bitcoin maximalist who refused to cooperate with authorities. Kulander's firm was involved in privacy-focused trading. Tehran operated outside Western financial oversight. Algaba facilitated untraceable transactions. And Nikolai Mushegian was building the infrastructure for truly decentralized money that no government or central bank could control. So it was all different countries, all different methods, but always the same pattern. Young, wealthy pioneers building alternatives to central banking disappear from this earth, just like those free energy inventors I've been talking about last segment. And so the more I looked into this Mushegian story, the more Puerto Rico certainly seems like a honeypot, intelligence connected operators with people like Brock Pierce, and like Epstein ties have clearly their fingerprints in Bitcoin. And I'll talk about the Epstein Bitcoin connection in a second. But yeah, those who play ball get rich, and those who don't, they wash up on beaches. This is not random tragedy. It's the old Fed playbook in a new arena. In the 1930s, small banks were crushed so Wall Street could consolidate. In the 1960s, Kennedy signed Executive Order 111110 and got Dallas in return. In 2008, Occupy Wall Street camps were raided in perfect unison. And now when crypto threatens the monopoly, its builders drop dead under quite mysterious circumstances. But the Fed can't ban Bitcoin or ban these cryptocurrencies outright. It's too decentralized, but it can infiltrate exchanges, co-opt corporate crypto, i.e. FTX, Coinbase, Binance, and push surveillance coins and neutralize the true believers. And the end game is CBDCs, programmable, trackable, freeze at will money, and digital fiat as a leash. Mushegian, he understood this. Obviously, his paranoia is starting less to seem like madness, but good rational recognition. And the same forces that built the Federal Reserve in secret at Jekyll Island are building kill switches into the blockchain today. It's quite clear if you challenge the Fed's monopoly on money, and you don't just risk bankruptcy, you risk your ability to live as a human being on Earth. The code still speaks, but the coders, they don't. And so the last part of the dead crypto kings and the crypto Epstein hypothesis, I mentioned that there's people like Brock Pierce who kind of represent pedo elite, and kind of Nikolai Mushegian's theory or tweet that he had been compromised by pedo elite, and the pedo elite had their hands all over crypto, and they're the ones that are killing the people who want to decentralize, and they're trying to take over cryptocurrency to make it centralized and make it so the Federal Reserve controls crypto. So yeah, this theory that suggests that the same forces that operated traditional honeypots and blackmail operations have simply updated their methods for the digital age. Instead of private jets and Manhattan townhouses, they use crypto conferences in Caribbean islands. Instead of cash payments, they use privacy coins and DeFi protocols. Instead of targeting politicians and celebrities, they target billionaire pioneers who control the future of money itself. And so on top of this symbolic meaning of the crypto Epstein hypothesis, it's actually not that symbolic. It's pretty literal, because we now know that Epstein was involved as an early founder of Bitcoin, and it emerged from the dark web platforms like Ross Ulbricht's Silk Road, which I'll cover on. I'll give the Silk Road a full episode potentially at some point for this podcast. But the connection between Bitcoin and the dark web is where the buying and selling of children happens. There's a theory that BTC means by the children, and Epstein's the Satoshi Nakamoto that actually founded Bitcoin. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. That's unsubstantiated, but essentially now the Federal Reserve has direct oversight to Bitcoin. Bitcoin has became the main cryptocurrency, and they killed all the other decentralized platforms that threatened their existence. And with those bodies, the best chance we had at overcoming this control system. So yeah, with all these deaths in mind, this is an exact parallel to the chain of free energy inventors dying, and it's a warning that if you create a free energy device and create a popular decentralized cryptocurrency, your life is at risk, and that's why geniuses are now afraid to approach this stuff. All right, now I'll speed run the end of the Federal Reserve Control System section. Chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13, CBDCs, your digital prison awaits. I've kind of hinted at this a few times already, but while people argue about crypto deaths, the system is building the safer, cleaner version of the future. CBDCs, which is money that can be tracked and controlled by default. The sales pitch is convenience and security, when the reality is programmable rules, where you can spend, what you can buy, whether it expires, whether your account can be frozen, whether dissent becomes a financial risk. And the scary part is not one policy, it's the architecture. Once the rails exist, any crises can become the excuse to tighten the settings. And the World Economic Forum has been open about this architecture. In 2016, they literally said this at the WEF, you'll own nothing and be happy. And this phrase emerged from their 2016 essay titled Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. So the dystopia is kind of staring us right in our face. It's CBDCs, programmable money, and essentially they're going to try and reduce the sovereignty of not just nations, but reduce the sovereignty of people, and essentially kind of control everyone's assets. That's the darker theory. I don't necessarily know if that's going to happen. That's what the pattern is indicating at this point. It's a little scary. But chapter 14, the 2020 test run, crisis and control. So COVID was the stress test for compliance and money printing in the same breath. Trillions conjured fast, assets inflated, big players consolidated, small players died, and the average person got a future where normal costs more forever. The deeper lesson is psychological. In a crisis, people accept restrictions that would have sounded insane the year before. So when the next emergency is financial, a banking crisis, cyber event, whatever, the solution menu will already be on the table. More surveillance, more control, and eventually programmable money at the fix. At some point, I'll have to get into the COVID conspiracy. Obviously, it was a conspiracy to once say it was created in a lab. Now we know that's true. I don't think it's too crazy to speculate that maybe it was perhaps created intentionally by the powers that be to consolidate control once again. We've seen it before. I don't think it's that crazy. Chapter 15, the last chapter, the fork in the road. So when you zoom out, it's pretty clear that the last 100 plus years of American money does not really feel like free markets and democracy. It's more like this playbook of engineered crises, public panics, and then some people walk away with more control than before. So from the Fed's birth to the Great Depression contraction, to war financing, to the gold window closing in 71, to 2008 bailouts and 2020 money printing, the pattern is scarcity for you, liquidity for them. And whether you think parts of the story are evil, incompetent, or just incentives doing what incentives do, the outcome looks the same. A system where the average person is permanently behind, and the top tier is permanently insulated. And so this fork in the road idea that there's going to be three futures, one, complete and total collapse, the debt spiral snaps, confidence breaks, and the solution offered in the chaos is a reset that conveniently comes with tighter control. 2, total control, CBDCs actually go live for real, cash fades out, and money becomes programmable rules, trackable, freezable, permission-based. And 3, pray to God, this is what happens, decentralized resistance, parallel systems become real. Bitcoin is digital sound money, gold, silver is physical anchors, but not just Bitcoin, because I think Bitcoin is compromised. Hopefully there's a bunch of other decentralized forms of crypto that emerge, but local banking, local trade, get gold and silver back in the mix as physical anchors, state pushing sound money laws, people rebuilding sovereignty from the ground up, and that third path is the only end with more freedom. All right, now a last little cherry on top in the Federal Reserve control system is the Rothschild-Lincoln theory. I didn't really learn about this one until recently, which is why it's kind of out of order here. But so it's a fascinating theory, and it seems to be a lot more than a theory at this point. The Civil War was not just about the North versus the South; it was money versus sovereignty. Abraham Lincoln bypassed European banking power with the greenbacks, which was government-issued currency that with no central bank and no foreign debt. And so, at the same time, Confederate bonds were being sold in Europe and financed and floated through powerful banking networks. And then there's Russia, fresh off of pushing out the European financial influence. Kind of Russia pushes out and bans the Rothschild European banking cabal from their country. And then in this civil war between the North versus South, people think it was just a civil war just within the United States. But what they don't know is that Russia backs the North. They send entire naval fleets to New York and San Francisco, and Britain and France, which are kind of Rothschild controlled back the South. The Rothschilds recognized Jefferson Davis as the president of the United States at the time. They essentially said, if you give us the central banking system, we will let you have slaves. The Civil War was not just North versus South; it's deeper than that. Not just slavery, not just ideology for control of the financial system, and so. Yeah, Alexander II, he was the Tsar of Russia that kicked out the Rothschilds, and I think that slavery was more so the byproduct. It was more so, yes, it was at its core good versus evil, and slavery had a lot to do with it because slavery is the reason that the Rothschild and the banking cabal backs the South, and the reason that Russia backs the North. And the Rothschilds essentially say, if you give us the Fed, we'll let you have slaves. And the French were in Mexico, the British were in Canada. Alexander II says we're joining the North. He was killed by the Bolsheviks brutally. So finally, that took a while. The Federal Reserve control system, timeline conclusion, from dead presidents to dead coders, from secret meetings on Jekyll Island to public experiments in mass compliance. The trajectory is undeniable. Every generation, the grip tightens. So 1830s was the last time America was debt-free, and Andrew Jackson survived the assassination attempt by European banking powers in all likelihood, and he kills the bank. This was the last time America was debt-free, the last time America was without a central bank. We can thank Andrew Jackson for that. The 1860s and the greenbacks happens. This was sovereignty and money and the Lincoln assassination, and likely the Rothschild and European banking influence that had a lot more to do with the Civil War. And this is the stuff that has literally suppressed history. You don't get taught it in schools, and it's very much true if you look into it. The Civil War was a lot more than the North versus the South. There's 1907, the Panic of '07, that allows JP and the Rothschild and Rockefeller control system to bail out the government. Obviously the 1910 Jekyll Island meeting plot. 1912, the Titanic sinks. JP Morgan's competition dies. 1913, the Federal Reserve is created. The income tax is illegally passed. 1933 is when gold is outlawed and Americans are stripped of sound money. 1945, we have the Bretton Woods Agreement and the IMF and the World Bank. 1963 is when the most famous president of all time challenges the system and ends up with his head taken off. 1971, gold window closes. Welcome to the fiat era. 2001, something happened in September of '01, and then the Patriot Act happens and the surveillance state increases. In 2008, trillions are stolen in plain sight from bailouts, and it's the beginning of quantitative easing. This is the beginning of using fake money to buy real assets. 2020, the world is locked down from a fraudulent pandemic in the name of safety, and power is continually consolidated. 21 to 23, 5+ crypto kings highlighted by Nikolai Mushegian and John McAfee die in extremely suspect ways. 2023, Fed now builds the rails for programmable money and CBDCs. 2030 is when the speculation of when the quote-unquote cage door closes. 2030 could be the year when shit gets real dystopian. That's the Federal Reserve control system in a nutshell. And so the last thing I'll say on the Federal Reserve control system after going through this timeline, the bodies, they keep piling up, whether that is the modern day cryptocurrency rabbit hole with figures like Mushegian and John McAfee, and these engineered crises like the Panic of '07 and the Great Depression, or potentially COVID. The crises keep escalating, the bankers keep winning, the control keeps getting consolidated. Praise be to Andrew Jackson, to Lincoln, to JFK, the true presidents that genuinely represented democracy, the true presidents that fought the central banks, and that wanted to keep the American dream alive, to keep the power into the hands of the many as opposed into the hands of this monolithic and ruthless conspiracy, as JFK coined that phrase. Most Americans still think the Fed is a part of their government, not the private cartel it truly is, and that confusion is the system's greatest protection. The Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. It is a private banking cartel that illegally took over this country in 1913. And that's why the title of my essay was that the Federal Reserve isn't just illegal, it is the greatest crime in the history of America.